Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to dive into something pretty fundamental, and we're going to act as philosophers while we do it. We're going to tackle this question of what makes some distinctions feel more real or objective than others.
Oh, that's a good one.
You've probably encountered this idea just intuitively, right? Some categories just seem to carve nature at its joints better than others.
Yeah. You just look at the world and you're like, yeah, that seems significant. And that seems kind of arbitrary.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So to get us started on this philosophical quest, let's consider a puzzle, a set of property pairs. These are drawn from our source material, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on natural properties.
Huh?
And we have a triangle versus a 3 to 5-sided figure with certain side constraints.
Okay.
A 90-degree angle versus an 87-degree angle.
Okay. So we're thinking geometry.
Yeah, a little bit. Something electrically charged versus something negatively charged that happens not to be a fish.
Okay.
Carbon dioxide versus cappuccino. The color green versus the infamous GRU.
Oh, yeah.
And the mathematical relation z equals x plus y versus z equals x cos y, which is a quirky function that's defined differently below a certain number.
Oh, boy.
And so, looking at these pairs, you probably have a really strong sense of which property in each pair feels more fundamental, more natural.
Yeah.
And it's not about how simple the words are or whether humans invented the concept or not. It's something deeper.
For sure. It's like which one picks out a more fundamental distinction in reality.
Exactly. And so the philosophical work we're doing today is to ask, what is that feeling? Can we move beyond just a gut reaction to this and make it more precise? That's the mission of this deep dive. We're going to try to unpack this concept of natural properties relying on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry.
It's going to be fun.
It is going to be fun. And it's vital to remember, that when philosophers talk about natural in this context, we're not talking about untouched wilderness or the opposite of something artificial in the everyday sense.
Right. It's a very particular meaning.
This is a very specific philosophical idea with a really rich history.
For sure.
And surprisingly far-reaching implications for how we understand the very fabric of reality.
I mean, we're getting into metaphysics here, and we're
Right.
not talking about, all natural peanut butter.
No.
We're talking about the nature of reality itself.
Exactly.
Big stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so our first task is to unpack this central idea. What does naturalness mean in philosophy? And maybe just as importantly, what doesn't it mean? Let's clear away some misunderstandings, right?
Yeah. We got to make sure we're all on the same philosophical page.
Exactly.
So one of the first things to get out of the way is that, just because something is considered unnatural in this philosophical sense, it doesn't automatically mean humans created it.
Right.
Even a property that seems super abstract and far removed from human activity, it could still be unnatural.
Right. So we need a more precise term than, artificial. And the entry suggests arbitrary or gerrymandered.
Oh, I like gerrymandered, yeah.
Yeah. Think about it like this. You're trying to divide a cake into pieces. You could cut straight lines.
Right.
Or you could carve out some, weird wiggly shape just because you can.
Just to be annoying.
Just to be annoying. Right. That wiggly shape is gerrymandered. That's kind of the idea of an unnatural property in philosophy.
Yeah, it doesn't follow any natural divisions. It's just you've imposed this weird arbitrary boundary.
Right. Exactly. And that leads to, a really core philosophical tenet for a lot of philosophers who think about naturalness, objectivity. And the idea that whether one property is more natural than another, that's an objective fact about the world.
Right. Independent of us, our opinions, languages, any of that.
Totally. The more natural distinction would still be more natural even if we weren't around to recognize it.
Right. It's out there. It's objective.
Yeah. And this is where some people push it even further, and they suggest that this relationship of naturalness isn't just an objective fact, but it's a necessary one.
Whoa, now we're getting into modal metaphysics.
Right.
So we're saying it couldn't have been any other way. It's baked into the very structure of reality.
Right. Now, it's worth noting that not everyone agrees with this.
Oh, of course not. It's philosophy. We disagree about everything.
Some argue that, our sense of some properties being more natural, that's actually just a reflection of our own human biases and how we happen to interact with the world.
Right. It could be like a projection. Right. We project our interests onto the world, and then we mistake those projections for, objective features.
Right. And the entry mentions that, this concept has become a cornerstone in contemporary philosophy, thanks to David Lewis, who really brought this idea to the forefront of metaphysical discussion.
Lewis. Yeah, he was a big
It
deal.
was a huge
He
deal.
built an entire philosophical system around naturalness, and it
Mhm.
kind of permeates his views on everything.
Totally. Now, when we think about these distinctions, it doesn't feel like a simple binary, does it? It's not just natural or unnatural, black or white.
Right. There are shades of gray, right? Degrees of naturalness.
Right. So how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And so at the very top of this scale, we have the idea of perfectly natural properties.
Right.
These are like the most natural things there are. Nothing's more natural than them. They're all equally natural, and they're kind of the ultimate building blocks of reality.
So if we could identify all the perfectly natural properties, we would have the key to understanding everything else.
That's the idea, right?
Mhm.
Lewis argued that a complete description of the world could, in principle, be achieved by just knowing which things instantiate all the perfectly natural properties.
Wow.
If you only knew about less natural properties, you would kind of be missing out on a deeper understanding of what's going on.
Okay. So what are some examples of perfectly natural properties?
Ah, see, that's the million-dollar question. And that's where things get really hard. It's kind of like a bold metaphysical hypothesis to say, what's perfectly natural?
Right.
It's like, what's the fundamental furniture of the universe? What's it made of?
So should we be looking to physics for those answers?
Yeah, a lot of philosophers, including Lewis, thought so. The idea is that if we could find like a final theory in physics,
Uh-huh.
it would describe reality in its most fundamental terms, and those might be the perfectly natural properties.
Right.
But even that's controversial because it assumes that physics is the ultimate arbiter of what's fundamental.
Right. What about consciousness?
Oh yeah,
Is it
constant.
is that a perfectly natural property?
Some people think so, especially those who believe in dualism, where the mental is fundamentally distinct from the physical. They might say that consciousness is a perfectly natural property that's just, not reducible to physics.
Right.
And you see similar things in ethics. Some philosophers who are like non-naturalist realists, they might argue that goodness or moral rightness, these are perfectly natural properties. They can't be defined in purely descriptive terms.
Okay, so moving back to the idea of degrees of naturalness, if a property isn't perfectly fundamental, how do we determine its level of naturalness?
Well, Lewis had an idea. He thought the relative naturalness of a property could be understood in terms of its relationship to the perfectly natural properties. So he said a property F is more natural than a property G if F has like a shorter and less complex definition in terms of perfectly natural properties than G does.
And when we say definition, we don't just mean a casual explanation in English, right?
Right. We're imagining like an ideal language where we have simple predicates for all the perfectly natural properties, and then you could define other properties in terms of those.
And so the shorter, the simpler the definition using those fundamental building blocks, the more natural the property itself.
Exactly.
But the entry mentions some challenges with this, like the infinite definitions worry.
Oh, yeah. That one's a bit of a headache. So the idea is that maybe some of the properties that we intuitively think are more or less natural, they actually end up having infinitely long definitions when you try to cash them out in terms of perfectly natural properties.
Uh-oh.
And then Lewis's account would say they're equally natural, which seems wrong.
So this length and complexity of definitions, it's more like a guide, a rule of thumb, rather than a strict definition.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. It gives us a starting point, but it's not the whole story.
So it sounds like the concept of natural properties, this isn't a brand new idea in philosophy. There are historical roots to this idea, right?
Yeah, definitely. While Lewis's work kind of brought it into the spotlight, the underlying intuition goes way back.
So Plato,
Oh, yeah, Plato.
what did he have to say about this?
Well, in the Phaedrus, he talks about natural joints in definitions. And this idea is, when you're defining things, you should divide them where the natural joints are, not just try to break them apart randomly.
Right.
So he clearly had this sense that some ways of categorizing things are more fundamental than others, just like we were talking about.
It's so interesting how these ideas keep popping up.
Right. And it shows you that this isn't just like some arbitrary philosophical invention. It's something that people have been grappling with for centuries.
Right. What about Plato's distinction between the forms justice, beauty, goodness versus hair, mud, and dirt?
Yeah. So for Plato, those forms, they represent a higher level of reality. They're more fundamental, more unchanging than everyday objects like, a clump of dirt.
Okay.
So again, it's this idea that some concepts capture more essential, maybe more natural aspects of reality.
And then we've got Aristotle.
Aristotle, of course.
He distinguishes between terms that have genuine unity and those that don't. like walking white man.
Ah, yeah. So he thought that some concepts are just kind of arbitrarily put together, whereas others have this kind of inherent unity. Like man is a unified concept, but walking white man is just like, you're just adding on random attributes.
Right.
It doesn't carve reality at its joints.
Yeah. And then even outside of Western philosophy, the entry mentions the Naya Vaishika tradition in classical Indian philosophy. They make a distinction between genuine universals, called jati, and imposed properties, called upadi.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting parallel.
Right.
So jati, these are like the real objective divisions in the world. They correspond to what we might call natural properties.
Mm.
And then upadi, these are more like conventions, linguistic conveniences. So again, we see this same basic distinction being drawn in a completely different philosophical tradition.
Right. And then, of course, there's this long tradition in Western philosophy of like distinguishing simple and complex properties. That goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, and it continues through Leibniz, Moore, Russell, Ramsey, Armstrong.
So how does this relate to the modern idea of naturalness?
It's a direct precursor, really. The idea that some properties are simple, primitive, and definable.
Mm.
They're like the building blocks for more complex properties. And that's pretty close to what we're talking about with naturalness, right?
But the big difference is that the older idea of simple properties was very much tied to these analogies with concrete objects, right?
Exactly.
Mm.
They thought of properties as having parts, just like objects do.
Right.
And the modern idea of naturalness is a bit more abstract. It doesn't rely on that kind of analogy.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about natural as it applies to properties, but we also talk about natural classes, right?
Right. Like the class of all green things versus the class of all grue things.
Right. So how do we make sense of that?
Well, the intuition is that if you have a natural property, the class of things that have that property should also be natural.
Okay.
But it's not quite that simple because, as we saw earlier, you can have coextensive properties that differ in their degree of naturalness.
Right.
So maybe the naturalness of a class is determined by the most natural property that defines it. Or maybe it's like some kind of aggregate measure of the naturalness of all the properties that the members share. There are different ways you could try to cash that out.
Okay. And then we've got this idea of plural naturalness.
Ah, yes. So this is the idea that you can have like some things considered together that are natural even if they don't form a neat class.
Mm-hmm.
Like think about all the things that aren't electrically charged. That seems like a natural collection of things, but it's hard to say what the criteria for membership in that class would be. It's not like there's one property that all those things share.
Well, it's more like a natural collection or grouping rather than a class defined by a single property.
Right, exactly. And then we've got natural propositions and concepts.
It does seem like intuitive that the proposition, some things are green, feels more natural than some things are grue.
Right.
So how do we account for that?
Well, a lot of philosophers think that propositions are really just properties, or at least they're very similar to properties.
Hmm.
So if that's right, then the naturalness of a proposition would just follow from the naturalness of the property it expresses.
Okay, but what about like really specific propositions or concepts? Like we might intuitively distinguish between like the concept expressed by there are vixens versus there are female foxes.
Yeah, that's where things get really tricky. Because if we allow for these fine-grained distinctions between propositions, even if they're about the same things in the world, then it's not so clear how naturalness plays in.
Right.
It might just depend on how you analyze those propositions.
Okay. The entry also talks about naturalness as a higher order predicate.
Ooh, yeah, that's getting a bit more technical.
What's going on there?
So usually when we talk about properties, we imagine that there's like a property for every way you could group things together,
Right.
but that can lead to some problems, like Russell's paradox, for example. So one way to avoid these problems is to think of is perfectly natural as a predicate that applies not to properties, but to other predicates or linguistic items.
So instead of saying that the property of being a triangle is natural, we would say that the predicate is a triangle is natural.
Exactly. And that might seem like a subtle difference, but it's actually quite important. Because it means that naturalness isn't just about the way the world is, it's also about how we describe the world.
And it avoids these tricky paradoxes that can come up if you assume that every description picks out a property.
Right. And this ties into the work of philosophers like Ted Sider, who talk about structural properties, or Dorr and Hawthorne, who suggest that we can use higher order logic to formalize this idea of naturalness as a higher order predicate.
Okay, then we've got natural magnitudes, things like mass and density.
Magnitudes are interesting. Some philosophers think that they're not even properties. They're like a separate category altogether. They're like ways of measuring things.
Hmm. So are they natural?
Well, that's a good question. And the answer might be separate from whether properties are natural. Lewis thought that perfectly natural magnitudes might exist even if perfectly natural properties don't.
Really?
Yeah. But the whole theory of magnitudes is kind of underdeveloped compared to the theory of properties, so there's still a lot of philosophical work to be done there.
Finally, we come to natural kinds, like tigers, chairs, things like that.
Right, right. So this is different from natural properties because a natural kind is like a category or a grouping of things, not a feature that a single thing has.
Okay.
So like even if being white is a natural property, the class of all white things isn't necessarily a natural kind.
Right, because they might not have a lot of other things in common.
Exactly. There's a whole literature on natural kinds, and it's a bit separate from the literature on natural properties, but there are connections. Like some philosophers think that a really natural kind might be characterized by having lots of correlated natural properties.
Okay, so we've talked about what natural properties are and the historical roots
Right.
and all these different related uses of natural. Now let's talk about how naturalness connects with other philosophical ideas. And the first one is similarity. As philosophers, how does naturalness shape our understanding of similarity?
Oh, that's a good one. I think similarity is probably the most intuitive connection. Lewis had this idea that sharing natural properties makes for similarity, and differing in natural properties makes for dissimilarity. So if two things share a lot of natural properties, they're going to be more similar.
And there have been attempts to define naturalness itself in terms of similarity, like Carnap's idea of quality circles, which were based on the similarity of our experiences.
Right.
But there were some problems with that approach, like Goodman's objections about the difficulty of imperfect community.
Yeah, it turns out that just appealing to similarity is a bit too vague.
Right.
Things can be similar in lots of ways,
Yeah.
and not all of those ways are equally relevant to naturalness.
Right. What about going the other way, using naturalness to define similarity?
Ah, yeah. So there's this idea called the division analysis of similarity. And it says that the dissimilarity between two things is just like the sum of the naturalness of all the properties that they differ in.
So, like, add up the naturalness of all the properties where one thing has it and the other doesn't.
Right, exactly. And that gives you a measure of how dissimilar they are.
Okay, that makes sense. But are there any problems with that?
Well, for one thing, you need like a numerical measure of naturalness, which
Yeah.
we don't really have.
Right.
And it's not clear that similarity just boils down to adding up naturalness like that.
Like, how much naturalness do we assign to being a triangle? And then if it's equilateral versus isosceles, does that make a difference?
Exactly.
Okay, another important philosophical concept that connects to naturalness is duplication. So how do we
Right.
define that rigorously as philosophers?
Yeah, so Lewis defines duplication in terms of perfectly natural properties. He says that two things are duplicates if and only if there's like a one-to-one correspondence between their parts. And the corresponding parts have exactly the same perfectly natural properties and stand in the same perfectly natural relations to each other.
But what if someone doesn't believe in perfectly natural properties?
Well, then they're probably not going to like Lewis's definition of duplication. And there are other worries too, like what if location is a perfectly natural property?
Right, because then two things could be exactly alike, but just in different places.
Right. So Lewis's definition would say they're not duplicates.
And he also talks about cross-world duplication.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that's where you have two things in different possible worlds that are duplicates.
Okay. And intrinsicness is defined in terms of duplication.
Right. Yeah, a property is intrinsic if and only if, whenever two things are duplicates, either both have it or neither do.
Okay.
So like being made of wood is intrinsic because if you have two duplicates, they're either both made of wood or neither are.
But are there any problems with this definition of intrinsicness?
Well, some philosophers think that some non-qualitative properties should count as intrinsic,
Like what?
like being identical to Barack Obama.
Okay.
That seems intrinsic to Obama,
Okay.
but it doesn't fit Lewis's definition.
Interesting.
And then we have qualitative indiscernibility. That's like an even stronger form of similarity than duplication. So not only do they have to be internally identical, they have to have all the same relations to everything else.
Okay.
And Lewis defines this in terms of a mapping between all the objects in two possible worlds.
And again, this relies on the idea of perfectly natural properties, right?
Yeah, the mapping has to preserve all the perfectly natural properties and relations.
But what about, like, properties of properties or properties of propositions.
Yeah, that gets tricky. Like, what if you have two people who are physically and mentally identical, but they're thinking about different things?
Right.
Are they still qualitatively indiscernible? It depends how you think about those higher order properties.
And qualitative properties themselves are defined in terms of qualitative indiscernibility. Sure.
Exactly. A property is qualitative if and only if, whenever two things are qualitatively indiscernible. Either both have the property or neither do.
So again, it comes back to this idea of perfectly natural properties and relations.
Yeah, it all hangs together.
And then we have qualitative supervenience.
Which is the idea that all the qualitative facts about the world are determined by the perfectly natural facts.
Okay.
So if you fix all the perfectly natural properties, you fix all the qualitative properties too.
But are there any problems with that?
Well, some philosophers think that there might be qualitative properties that don't supervene on the perfectly natural ones,
Hmm.
like maybe some emergent properties or maybe some properties that depend on the history of the world in a way that the perfectly natural properties don't capture.
Now let's talk about modality, like possibility and necessity. How does naturalness play into that?
Ah, yes. So Lewis has this principle called truth supervenes on being, or TSB for short.
Okay.
And it basically says that if you have two possible worlds that are exactly alike in terms of what exists and what perfectly natural properties things have, then they'll also be exactly alike in terms of what's true.
Okay.
So it's another way of saying that the perfectly natural properties are really all you need to know to figure out everything else.
But does that really capture the idea of completeness? What about necessary truths?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's related to the worries about qualitative supervenience. Like,
Mhm.
if there are qualitative properties that don't supervene on the perfectly natural ones, then maybe there are truths that don't supervene either.
And then there's this idea of the independence of perfectly natural properties.
Right, sometimes called minimality.
What's that all about?
So the idea is that no perfectly natural property should be, like, definable in terms of the other perfectly natural properties.
No,
It should be, like, fundamental and independent.
Hmm.
But that leads to some interesting consequences. Like, if a relation is perfectly natural, its converse might not be.
Really?
Yeah, because the relation already kind of implies its converse.
Yeah.
And some people think that's counterintuitive. Like, why should one direction of a relation be more natural than the other?
And what about negation?
Yeah, if a property is perfectly natural, its negation shouldn't be, because the negation is just defined in terms of the property.
Okay.
But again, some people find that counterintuitive. They think that a property and its negation should be equally natural.
So this minimality principle, it seems like it has some interesting implications, but it's also controversial.
Yeah, it's not without its problems,
And then there's this idea of combinatorialism.
which is the idea that you can basically combine perfectly natural properties however you like.
Like any combination is possible.
Yeah, so like if you have perfectly natural properties for being red, being round, and being heavy, then it's possible to have something that's red, round, and heavy.
Mm.
But it's also possible to have something that's red, round, and not heavy,
Right.
and so on.
But isn't there a problem there with things like mass?
Yeah, that's a big worry. Because if you have something that's really massive, it's probably going to be heavy too.
Right.
So it's not clear that you can just combine mass with other properties however you like. There might be some constraints.
So combinatorialism is a really strong claim, and it might not be true in all cases.
Yeah, it's a bit too strong for comfort, I think.
Now let's talk about universals and tropes. How does naturalness relate to those ideas?
Well, Lewis was inspired by Armstrong's theory of universals. And some philosophers have suggested that you could just identify perfectly natural properties with universals.
Hmm.
But that leads to some problems. Like, if being red and being square are both perfectly natural properties, then their conjunction, being red and square, should also be a perfectly natural property.
But that seems to violate the minimality principle.
Right. So maybe you could say that perfectly natural properties correspond to simple universals, like universals that don't have any parts.
Okay.
But then you have to figure out what it means for a universal to have parts, which is a whole other can of worms.
What about tropes?
Yeah, so Lewis also thought about how naturalness could be understood in terms of tropes.
Okay.
He said that a perfectly natural property could be defined as a property whose instances are all tropes that are duplicates of each other. But that definition only really works if you accept modal realism, which is Lewis's view that all possible worlds are equally real.
One of the most important applications of naturalness is in Lewis's analysis of laws of nature.
Ah, yes, the best system analysis.
Right. So how does that work?
So the basic idea is that a law of nature is a generalization that's part of the best systematization of all the facts.
Okay. And what makes a systematization best?
Well, it has to be simple and strong.
Okay. What does that mean?
Simple means that it's like concise and elegant. It doesn't have a lot of extra bells and whistles. And strong means that it makes a lot of accurate predictions about the world.
Okay. And naturalness comes in with simplicity,
All
right?
right. So Lewis thought that the simplest systematization would be one that uses predicates for perfectly natural properties,
Okay.
because those properties are like the most fundamental, so you don't need a lot of complicated definitions to describe them.
But is there a problem there with us not knowing which properties are perfectly natural?
Yeah, that's a big worry.
Wait.
Like, what if we think we found a simple and strong systematization, but it turns out that we were wrong about which properties are perfectly natural?
Right.
Then our systematization wouldn't really be capturing the laws of nature.
So our knowledge of the laws would be, like, shaky.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the alternative? Defining naturalness in terms of laws.
Yeah, so you could say that a natural property is just one that figures in the laws of nature.
Okay.
But then you have to explain what it means to figure in a law.
Right. And that might be tricky.
It is tricky. And there are other problems too, like what about acceleration in Newton's second law?
Hmm.
That seems to figure in a fundamental law, but it's not clear that it's a perfectly natural property.
Another interesting place where Lewis uses naturalness is in his theory of mental and linguistic content.
Ah, yeah, the reference magnet idea.
Right.
So the idea is that more natural properties are easier to refer to and think about. They're like magnets for reference.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, Lewis thinks it's because our minds are kind of biased towards naturalness.
Hmm.
Like we're naturally inclined to think and talk about the more fundamental features of reality.
Okay.
So it's easier for us to refer to natural properties, even if we don't fully understand them.
And this was partly Lewis's response to Putnam's skepticism about reference.
Right. Putnam argued that even if we have a perfect scientific theory, we can still be wrong about what our words refer to.
Okay.
But Lewis thinks that naturalness can help to solve that problem, because the most natural referent for a term is going to be the one that's most deeply embedded in the structure of reality.
Okay. So naturalness helps to fix reference.
Exactly.
And then Lewis developed this more complicated theory of mental content where he talks about eligibility, right?
And eligibility is basically just another word for naturalness. And he thinks it plays a crucial role in determining what our thoughts and sentences are about.
Okay, and there's this weaker version of the reference magnet idea.
Right. So instead of saying that we always refer to the most natural property, you could just say that natural properties are more likely to be referred to across different possible worlds.
Okay, so it's like a probabilistic claim.
Exactly.
Naturalness makes it more likely that something will be referred to.
Right.
Another area where naturalness is used is in philosophy of induction. Goodman's Grew problem. Expert speaker.